this is sort of where we'll be living today, thinking about what relationality looks like in all kinds of digital spaces and thinking through some of the complexities of where that fits. This is sort of how we'll structure it. We'll be talking a bit about the way that we can't talk about Indigenous knowledge systems without talking about concepts of theft, right? And how that has really characterized what that looks like in 2022. We'll move on to a discussion of the way that adoption of technology has always been a part of Indigenous knowledge systems instead of sort of how we perceive it in a contemporary sense now. And so that process of survivance has really kind of been consistent throughout the work. We're going to delve into sort of the theoretical framework, the joyful imagination, and the possibilities of Indigenous futurisms. And then we'll sort of end off in looking at the ways that relationality in online spaces are functioning. So a quick introduction. This is me. I am, as Adam was saying, I'm an academic librarian at Mount Royal University, which is an undergraduate university in Calgary in Canada. So my work it really draws from the places that I come from. So this is a picture of me as a baby. I'm in a little moss bag, so a way that we wrap up babies in our culture so that they feel close and tight and cared for after they leave the womb. And so that's me with a whole lot of hair, which I'm sure gave my mom a lot of heartburn. And then behind it, the photo is of the river that flows through the city that was probably closest to me, the North Saskatchewan River. In our language, it's Kichiwane Sipi, so the fast flowing, sort of it moves at the pace that someone could quickly walk. So that's sort of how we make meaning from that. And it's about September in this picture behind. So I'm really lucky to have grown up in my territory. Not every Indigenous person grows up with that because of forced migration, urbanization, the destruction of land. But I'm very grateful that I got to grow up where I was from and where my people have been from. I'm a member of Michelle First Nation, which is a group of people who they started with Iroquois men who came west of the fur trade and married Cree and Métis women. And then settled sort of not too far from, not settled is such a funny word, but lived in the space around Edmonton. So I grew up in a small town called Calahoo. So my work is firmly situated in what we call Wagotwin. So this is a Cree concept of relationality. And as you can see, here's the baby that's living inside of me right now. I'm 5 months pregnant. And so these concepts are starting to have an entirely different framework for me right now. So this baby will be born here, right behind the photo that's behind the ultrasound photo is of Tsuut'ina Nation, where a number of my cousins live. It's just close, just outside of the city. So that's where this baby will be born. So born in a different context, but to the same people. Now, Wagotwin, as we turn to it, is a legal framework. It's sort of an ethical imperative. What it asks us to do is to know our relatives. And so this means that things like genealogy are really important to us, but it also means that it extends beyond the family unit. So we're not just looking at sort of an anthropological sense of kinship, but rather how do our relations kind of expand beyond? So that can include relations that emerge from commerce. It includes relations that come through adoption. For example, in treaty making with the Crown, when my ancestors signed Treaty 6, they saw taking the Queen's relatives as their cousins. And so they have language around that treaty making that really articulates what those relationships are. It also extends beyond human beings. So it's thinking about kinship beyond the human. So we're thinking about other than human kin, animals, but also plants, the land, water, the things that we have to sort of exist within this framework. Now, this concept is big and complicated, and with it also comes responsibility and accountability. So it's not enough to simply know who you are related to, but rather to understand who am I responsible for and accountable to. That's really baked into it. And the kind of similar Cree concept of meoitietuen means we live well within these relationships. So it's not just simply the wakotun in knowing it, but the way it's enacted through meoitietuen. So these two things sort of combine for us to think about not only sort of what's all around us, what we're in relationship to, but also our ancestors, and just like this little baby on the screen, our descendants as well. So let's delve into a discussion about theft. What you see on the screen are two death certificates, and they come from my father's uncles who both died as babies. And so what you see here is the way that oftentimes we have in archives, in collections, a misplaced authority and inaccuracies that get kind of ossified in the record. So I'll just draw your attention over here. In the registration of death, they have a note for racial origin. Now I'll note, these are two babies that come from the exact same parents, Henry and Clara Loyer. And so they're both Métis people. They have both been Métis people for, their ancestors have been Métis for generations on generations, about 8 generations back at least that we can track. And yet there's something kind of quite notable here. So in this registration of death, this baby wasn't given a name, so baby boy of Henry Loyer. We look under the racial origin and we see the term half-breed. So that was a term that was used at a particular time period to refer to Métis people. So these were often people who, this is a post-contact Indigenous people that emerged after the fur trade was in Canada. So half-breed on this one. If we turn to the second, Alan Gilbert Loyer is the second baby. And you'll see under racial origin here, he's listed as a Cree Indian, despite the fact that his parents are both Métis. Now, so much of what we find in archives, in records, comes to us from an outsider's perspective, and this is really an excellent example of that. Whoever was writing down this certificate made assumptions on racial origin that then are now in the record, that we now turn to as what we might call verifiable evidence. And so this is a weird way of parsing racial origin and seeing it through kind of a lens of administrative category. And so we can see the way that this process of theft doesn't just happen when we think about repatriation and all the items that were stolen, but also in the way that identities were very specifically prescribed, ascribed perhaps, to individuals who are Indigenous without sort of being able to hone in on the specifics. So this is an example from my own life, and I think it really illuminates the way that theft really kind of is a consistency through this work. So this means that anytime we're working with an Indigenous knowledge system, something as small as what was the racial origin of our ancestors is really characterized by these processes of genocide and epistemicide. Now, I want to be really clear here. When I'm speaking about this, I'm not working within a framework that assumes that no one is Indigenous anymore. Sometimes we get that idea of sort of the purity myth, right? So the only true Indigenous people are uncontacted groups of people that exist outside of what we call civilization. This is not the framework we're working within, right? Indigeneity is ongoing, it's persistent, it exists in the now, and it will exist in the future. But it does mean that every time we engage in what we might call Indigenous research or delve into kind of technology that takes on these issues, we have to be really thoughtful about the ways that theft has characterized this work. We exist within a space of salvage archaeology. So at certain time periods, there was a real fear that indigeneity was disappearing. So there was going to be no more Indigenous people, that everyone was going to be extinct. And so there was a real sort of push to have people go forward and to capture as much of that as we can see. So we see that in Edward Curtis's photos of Indigenous people. Sometimes they would be in their spaces. He's known to have removed a clock that was in someone's house because he didn't think that they should have that technology. It didn't kind of fit into his concept of salvage archaeology that he was getting to. We also see it in the way that so much of what is existing in museum collections now comes to us from that time period, right? That fear that this knowledge that this culture was disappearing. So much of what we sit within exists in this fracturing of an Indigenous knowledge system of all of the things that they used to look like, also because of that break with the land, right? So as people are moved on to reserves and reservations, we see that land, if we're drawing back from Tuagotwin, land as that foundational relationship becomes fractured from the knowledge system because people are no longer able to access those relations that they have. So with that in mind, with that concept of theft, let's turn our attention to technology. So that salvage archaeology has that framing of Indigenous people as somehow always removed from technology, right? That sort of nostalgic past. We might sometimes call it the vanishing Indian, or sometimes the environmental Indian, someone who is so connected to nature that they're one with it. And while our worldviews do decenter humans and place them within a broader network of kinship, this framing is frankly quite strange. It really sees Indigenous people and technology as two separate things, as though adaptation is not part of any culture, and has really been a huge component of Indigenous culture for many, many years. I like this public domain Frederick Remington print. This is very much sort of a media image of what Indigenous people are, set in the plains. This guy is on a horse, he's got his headdress and hair flowing in the wind, he's got his spear with him. It's sort of silhouetted by the setting sun, this classic nostalgic image. But the horse in this picture is an example of technology. Horses returned to the Americas with non-Indigenous people. And so that frequent image that we are very used to seeing in all kinds of places requires us to consider adaptation. It puts a technology in front of us, one that was taken on by Indigenous people. And the same is true of the food that we think of as being Indigenous, so bannock or fry bread. So using commodity flour, really awful rations that were given out by governments to Indigenous people, poverty food to create a food of survival, right? So taking those rations and making something new, a technology, and that being so enduring, being synonymous with indigeneity. We also see that in the background photo. This is a photo of a family gathering we had last summer. And the teepees that we have now are not made out of hide in the same way that they were. They're made out of canvas. And so we're still returning to the technologies that are useful to us, discarding what doesn't make sense, kind of engaging in what does. Yet the poles, the lodgepole pines that you see here, those persist, those have stayed the same. Now, of course, they've grown bigger because with the introduction of horses, you no longer needed just dogs to carry your houses. But even now, if we're throwing lodgepole pines into the back of a truck, it's that connection to the past and that awareness that this technology was good and will continue. So any discussions of technology that pit Indigenous people against it, I think that's sort of falling into this falsehood that we see in front of us. Even our most inaccurate, nostalgic images of an apparently dying race involve adaptation. And so let's think about, what if we think about the future differently? So this is a beautiful mask that came about from an art exhibit called Breathe. And so this came out at the start of the pandemic when the founders asked Indigenous people to create masks thinking through this moment in time. And so they could use techniques and materials that were sort of traditional, but they could also reimagine what this looked like. So this particular mask is by Graham Parody, and it's called Quillpocalypse Now. And so he writes about this. This COVID mask is an Indigenous futurism inspired by a nightmare of a post-apocalyptic world where the birch bark population, one of our traditional materials used for quill work, has been decimated by settler resource extraction, and we quill on whatever we can. So you can see he's got all kinds of materials here. He's got studs and wire mesh. Right in this section here, kind of the yellow bits, this has all been quilled with porcupine quills, which you'll also see in my earrings. I'm not sure if you can see them. They're at the bottom of these earrings here. So these are quilled on birch bark, but he's imagining a world where we no longer have birch bark. These earrings are also sort of, I've worn them specifically in thinking about Indigenous futurisms. Erin Consmo is the creator of them. She's a two-spirit Métis, amazing artist and activist, and she works under the name Land Glitter. So these are on birch bark, but the decoration here are fish scales that have been dyed, and we have the porcupine quills at the bottom. So a modern kind of reimagining of big danglers, but thinking through sustainable materials. These are all materials that emerge from the land, will be allowed to rest at the end of them. They're not sort of imagined to be preserved forever. So rethinking sort of what our space looks like. The reason that I think the work of Indigenous futurisms is so helpful for me is that it's contending with that always historicized image of indigeneity that we saw on the previous slide. And the concept of Indigenous futurisms borrows a lot from Afrofuturism, which is that rejection of the white utopias that we always see. So this was coined by Mark Derry, and it's thinking about reclamation and Black liberation. So Wakanda, we can think about Alicia B. Wormsley's artwork that are sometimes billboards that just read, "There are Black people in the future." Now, Indigenous futurisms, in a similar tone, are thinking about the way that Indigenous people have survived genocides, and we continue to live in never-ending trauma in sort of the dystopian now. So we see this emerging in lots of cool stuff. I mean, the mask in front of us is a great example, but also terms like a tribe, or bands like A Tribe Called Red, right? Thinking about powwow music as dance music in clubs, or Sunny Asu's paintings, which add that West Coast formline art that we're often quite familiar with understanding as Indigenous art. So he's adding formline aliens over colonial landscapes of Haida villages. So intervening into these sort of colonial conceptions of his ancestors' villages by putting these formline aliens over top of them. Annie Puktoktok is another one. Thinking about, she's an Inuit, she's a now deceased Inuit artist who is thinking about the way that her everyday life could be portrayed in the work that she did. Now, I think what's so interesting about Indigenous futurisms is that it's positioning technology as emerging from Indigenous worldviews rather than existing outside of them or being tacked on. So I find this framing really helpful for me in thinking about the kind of work that I want to do. There's a great article in Guts magazine by Yaz Morgan, who, and the title of the article is Visual Cultures of Indigenous Futurisms. And in it, in the introduction, I'll just read you a section of it because I find it so compelling. So they write, simultaneously in the future and the past, we are living in the dystopian now, as Molly Swain of the podcast Métis in Space has named it. Indigenous peoples are using our own technological traditions, our worldviews, our languages, our stories, and our kinship as guiding principles in imagining possible futures for ourselves and our communities. As Erica Lee has described, in knowing the histories of our relations and of this land, we find the knowledge to recreate all that our worlds would have been, if not for the interruption of colonization. So this to me is such an exciting possibility in thinking about what we can do. It really is a break with that sort of static nostalgia that we're often dealt with. And so for me, this is a space where I can think kind of broadly, openly, and joyfully. And for me, this sort of relationality becomes really important. So this is a view from my parents' house in the background. There's their garden from a few years ago. And then what we see on sort of the foreground is a conceptual model of Indigenous systems of knowledge created by Sandy Littletree, who's Dene and Eastern Shoshone. She's an assistant lecturer at the iSchool at the University of Washington. And in this, I find this to be such an interesting approach, a way of talking about what makes Indigenous systems of knowledge different. If you follow me on TikTok, you'll know that I've done a little bit of work talking through this conceptual model because I find it so elegant and so kind of tied into what we're talking about. Now, we've talked a lot about Wagotwin today. That's sort of at the core of what we're doing. And then the peoplehood component as well, thinking about indigeneity is something that persists through things like a ceremonial cycle, language, the connection to land and that history that's in that kind of that circle. But this circle, number C, or letter C, is really where we see the difference. Indigenous ways of knowing within these systems privilege verbs. Now, the systems of knowledge that we are all really familiar with in grad school or if we're working in universities, we understand what information transfer looks like, but the verb component of it is often decentralized or obscured. So we might talk about it as a methodology, here's the research methodology that got me here. We might see it at a writer's fest when we have, maybe we have someone talking about their craft, but oftentimes these verbs are obscured in our knowledge systems and the focus is on the product, the sort of commodity that we have, the documents, the books, that sort of thing. Now, I want to talk briefly about this concept of theft and fracture again. So if we imagine, and I also want to note too that these two things are co-constituted. So it's not sort of like one thing begets another, rather they emerge, they are co-constituted. So let's consider an example. Within these Indigenous ways of knowing, let's think about a canoe journey, right? Canoeing as our verb. Within that, there's going to be all kinds of expressions that emerge, right? There's going to be the canoe and paddles. There's going to be what we need to wear to keep ourselves warm, dry, and safe. There's going to need to be the food that we eat or where to find that food, the sort of logistics of that, as well as maybe the songs that we use to keep time and the stories that emerge from the process. Now, in general, however, the stuff that we create from this verb get fractured into different institutions, and I'll show you how. So a published story about that year's canoe journey might go into a library. The logistics meal planning document might end up in an archive, and the canoe might end up in a museum. So all of those live in different institutions, right? They become fractured and they no longer become kind of a consistent system that we can work within. So this process of theft and sort of epistemicide doesn't just happen in taking the things away. It's also removing the things from their own relationality with each other, right? So the canoe on its own, holds multiple stories, but with other components, it tells more of the story and maintains sort of that information transfer. It also means that if we have all that stuff, the canoe, the song, the stories, we're much better set up to do information transfer in this way. I also like bringing in Adam Gaudry's work, which is on insurgent research. And insurgent research takes a different tone. So we have these processes of extraction that really characterize so much of our work in academic libraries or in academia in general. And so he's saying most of the time, the research we engage in is quite extractive, right? We're going in, we're taking information from a population and then presenting it to an entirely different population. And really not considering that initial population as the arbiters of what is valuable or true or effective. And his work says, what if we did it differently? So his concept of what insurgent research might be is grounded in, so there's kind of 4 components. It's grounded in, it respects and ultimately seeks to validate Indigenous worldviews. The output is geared towards use by Indigenous communities and Indigenous people. 3, research processes and final products are ultimately responsible to Indigenous communities, meaning that Indigenous communities are the final judges of the validity and effectiveness of that research. And 4, research is action-oriented and works as a motivating factor for practical and direct action among Indigenous peoples and in Indigenous communities. I see this work happening in the Digital Wagotwin and Cultural Governance Lab at Toronto Metropolitan University. So that's run by Yaz Morgan, whose work I've talked about before. They're a fantastic researcher, and you can find their work at digitalkinship.ca. I'll pop that in the chat after. But recently, Yaz has spoken really clearly about kind of research on TikTok. And what they've said is, I don't want to study Indigenous youth on TikTok. I want to be co-creators with them. And really, I think this ties so nicely into this concept of insurgent research. Why are we so interested in sort of pulling from this and making meaning from it, rather than letting the youth talk about this work themselves? And the work in this Digital Wagotwin and Cultural Governance Lab has really been thinking through how TikTok, for example, functions. So they did a lovely little review of the work that I had done. And so they were thinking about the way that there's a shift in what we see in online spaces. So there's certainly people that are sort of portraying that stoic, resilient Indigenous person that we saw in that, that painting that we were looking at. That will always be compelling to certain communities. But what I find so compelling about spaces like TikTok and the way that relationality is built is that there sort of is a space for sort of silliness in there, of inside jokes, of that affirmation of Indigenous life that is not so worried about putting on a show for outsiders. And for me, the work that I see and the work that I'm most interested in is on intergenerational joy, because when we talk about Indigenous issues, the phrase intergenerational trauma is frequently used. And I think that we also can take joy as our lens moving forward. So as we sort of wrap up this chat today, I'm really interested in the ways that you're thinking about relationality in different spaces as well. I see relationality as embracing adoption of technology, and really as a continuation of the work that's been done before. It's not sort of new or contemporary, all of a sudden we're doing it. It's sort of a continuation of the work that has always persisted. Now, we have to be thoughtful about how it's being used. We have to consider the ways that, the translation of culture becomes shifted and altered in new technologies. I think about protocol very frequently and what can be shared and what shouldn't be shared. But for me, the lack of barriers for Indigenous youth in actually engaging in spaces like TikTok or in other digital spaces, it allows them to connect with each other and connect in solidarity with each other. It's thinking through a joyful future, right? Imagining that Indigenous futurisms that is really firmly rooted in the idea that we'll continue to love and care for each other, not just now, not just in the past, but into the future.